Gut, dann nutze ich die Zeit, um unseren heutigen Gast vorzustellen. Rano Turaeva, frisch, ich habe gerade gelernt, also seit Oktober habilitiert, Ethnografin, Ethnologin, habilitiert zum Thema Migration und Islam in Russland. Also ein ganz spannendes Forschungsthema. Ihre Forschungsinteressen sind Macht und Machtstrukturen, Staat und Staatsstrukturen, informelle Ökonomie, Mobilität, Islam, Migration, das wundert jetzt nicht, Russland und Zentralasien, Halal-Märkte in Russland, Gender und Islam. Zu ihren Stationen gehört das Max-Planck-Institut für ethnologische Forschung an Halle an der Saale sowie das Leibniz-Institut für Länderkunde in Leipzig. Sie hat bereits vielfach zu den Themen publiziert. Ihr noch nicht erschienenes Buch habe ich gerade erwähnt. Davor das quasi aktuellste Buch ist Halal Economics in Non-Muslim Countries bei Palgrave zusammen mit Herrn Rose erschienen. Zudem ein Edited Volume on Labor Mobilities and Informal Practices, Power Institutions and Mobile Actors in Transnational Spaces, 2021 auch in Co-Autorschaft erschienen. Es ist mir eine ganz große Freude, dass Sie unsere Grundlagenvorlesung bereichern. Zum einen um eine Disziplin, die wir hier am Institut nicht haben, und zum anderen um ein Thema, das wir bisher in dieser Form noch nicht gehört haben. Sie sind herzlich willkommen und haben das Wort.
Vielen, vielen Dank für diese schöne introduction. Sorry that I prepared my speech in English, but if anybody will have any questions in German, I can of course answer them in German. So I really appreciate this chance to share my ideas about my work and about my concerns with you. And thank you very much for this invitation. I was really looking forward to this lecture. And nice to see so many faces here. So yesterday I was actually watching a documentary about the new geopolitical configurations in Russia, Iran and China. I think it's available still in Arte channel. And in this interview, a Chinese politician verbally repeated the definition of Escobar's pluriversality against universality, namely challenging the notion of singular, universal reality, advocating instead for the recognition and coexistence of multiple diverse worlds, each within its own epistemologies, ontologies, and ways of being. So this Chinese man said, there must not be one universal form of democracy or human right, as we have our own traditions and definitions of other forms of governance which feed our culture. So the same definition resonated with other voices from Central Asia, who also argue in the same line of pluriversal world traditional definition of gender, human rights, justice. So we know all these concepts, right? So I take you to one of the mosques in Uzbekistan, because I was doing my now later research after I finished my book on Russia. I came back to Uzbekistan to do some more field work on Islam and polygamy in Uzbekistan. So I had this very long conversation with a local mullah who long explained me about his understanding of gender roles, gender rationalities, which not everybody understands according to him. Also, I was asking him questions about polygamy and Islam in Uzbekistan. He started to explain why there is a conflict between mother-in-laws and young brides in Uzbek households. Since I was writing much about the social roles of young brides in Uzbekistan, I was very curious about the explanation of such a locally authoritative person as a local mullah who receives tens of people every day who come with all kinds of questions related to family, economy, work, education, even most popular themes like sex lives, sex practices. A local mullah was sitting in a spacious big room covered with carpets and kurpachkas. These are small traditional mattresses like long sitting mats and table with bread, sweets on the table with a pot of tea. So I was wearing, of course, a long dress, head covered, introduced myself, my work about marriage, Islam and gender in Central Asia. He invited me to sit down. We had an interesting conversation about his work, his opinions about marriage and life in general in Uzbekistan. Out of the blue, he started to explain me why there is never-ending conflict between mothers-in-law and young brides. He said that women in that age, when they become mother-in-law and new brides come to their house, mothers have to face the fact that their son is now shared between her and his wife. I quote him, "But that's not all. That's all, as all believe," he continued, I quote, "the husband of this mother-in-law either has another lover or unable to satisfy her sexually, and the young couple show all kinds of sexual activities, disappear in their bedrooms, and mothers-in-law have to watch all these who are left with no satisfaction at all, and that's where conflict starts," he explained. End of quote. He also continued that the conflicts at home are not bearable for the men, as men need to work all day. When they come home, they cannot relax. What happens is that they have to escape all the problems at home and find other kinds of relaxation outside the house. He explained, justifying polygamous relations indirectly. Also, he had to note that polygamy became legally prohibited since 2017 in Uzbekistan. So what do these two interpretations have in common? And what can they tell us about decoloniality and the coloniality of power? Both interpretations are local definitions of social relations, represent local knowledge about these relations. So I deliberately began with such provocative comparison to highlight the diverse directions decolonial discourses can take and the questions they may open up. I must also admit that I cannot answer all the open questions that I will be opening today by the end of this lecture, as I believe that raising relevant, pressing questions is already a big step forward that at least I can do. So what I would like to do today is to summarize the thoughts, ideas, pressing issues which continuously concern me as an Uzbek woman, a mother, an anthropologist or native anthropologist, minority member in Germany or migrant, minority academic in German academia, decolonial thinker, an activist, drawing upon my own experiences from obviously very different angles due to my identities. But I will not repeat the content of previous talks, keynote lectures, and other lectures on the same topic that I gave, which are already available, also recorded that you can look up in the YouTube channels. Instead, I will briefly touch upon some general points I would like to make within the topic of decolonizing Central Asian studies and anthropology in general. Some of these ideas have been also published in academic form, in academic article form, or blog entries. For example, we had another entry where we were working with people who within degrowth movements, who are also anti-capitalist scholars and practitioners who are promoting degrowth. So also, I'm an anthropologist with research experience in the post-Soviet context. Today's examples will focus on Central Asian studies, of course. My aim is to highlight areas where decolonial work still need to be done and where the foundations and principles of knowledge production must be radically reconsidered. The ideas I would like to share today are shaped, of course, as I said, from my life experiences and diverse work I have been engaged since early 90s. This includes not only research and teaching, but also intellectual engagement and activism. My work is largely divided, I would say, into several areas, such as theoretical research, emerging from decades of studying post-Soviet countries and economies. This research critically rethinks established frameworks, which are used to study processes like migration, gender, and religion, which is also to be read in my publications, nicely mentioned already. Additionally, my academic experience within European academia and these interactions I had with global academic networks have significantly influenced my thinking so far. It's for sure that I cannot cover all of these aspects of these complex relations and processes in one lecture, but I will try to bring only some snapshots from those. Decolonial movements and debates in Central Asia, which I began actively engaging with, I think, in 2018, have gained significant momentum, especially after 2022, when Russia attacked Ukraine. The imperial aggression of Russia has significantly impacted how people and politicians related to their colonial past and neo-colonial present, using decolonial lens, sparking a re-evaluation of the region's historical ties to Russia and prompting a renewed focus on sovereignty and regional identity. Imperialistic motivations of Putin has been taken now more seriously than ever. Mass arrival of Russian so-called relocants to Central Asia. I don't know why they are called relocants and why not Russian migrants to Central Asia. I mean, these are masses. This adds another wave of tensions and rethink their added, which adds a lot of complexity to already existing tensions and positioning within colonial matrix of Russian and Western domination. War in Palestine added even more complexities into the current negotiation of identities and anti-Western ideas among Muslim practitioners in Central Asia. Decolonizing Central Asia at the level of geopolitical negotiation, of national positioning of Central Asian governments is not the field I would like to engage with today, but rather focus on epistemic violence conducted by various colonial powers in Central Asia, which has several layers, I argue, of colonial past and neocolonial presence. Decolonization, recolonization, other relevant processes, diverse actors in Central Asia engage with at very different levels of societal engagement, political communication, academic discourse, and knowledge production. Decoloniality writers and thinkers, like, as we know, Guihano, Medina Tolstanova, Daswani, following the calls by revolutionary figures as Fanon, methodological critique by Linda Tuhuai Smith, offer us insightful analysis of these complex dynamics I would like to outline today. I saw that you had Medina Tolstanova, Professor Medina Tolstanova also spoke here, and I'm sure already that she shared her important insights into post-Soviet specificities of colonial heritage and legacies dominated by Russian imperialism and other colonial projects conducted in Central Asia. I must admit I'm very much inspired by her writings, and she offers a lot of important insights into this very particular regional colonial legacies. So following the calls by decoloniality thinkers and largely following thoughts of Guihano and Foucault, I will try to apply decolonial lens in my analysis of these current complex processes of negotiating identities and colonial legacies in the region. Before I will share with my own experiences of decolonizing efforts and theoretical ideas, I would like to briefly turn your attention to the works of Latin American authors and their explanations of confusions about the concept, such concepts as colonization versus coloniality or decolonization versus decoloniality. Also, I'm sure those interested in those debates are fluent in those fine distinctions between those concepts, but I find still it's necessary to make sure that it's clear which definitions I apply in my work and my analysis, since there is still a lot of confusion among those concepts, even in the youngest publications on the same topic. So if one looks at the differences, of course, as the words itself suggest, that colonization or decolonization are historical processes or events with particular dynamics, and where you have coloniality or decoloniality, which is much more broader than events itself, and it comprises a lot of more processes and dynamics that really engages with coloniality of power. So I would like to stop on the decoloniality definition of the decoloniality offered by Walsh in their book from 2018, who wrote together with Mignolo. And I would like to read that definition because I find it very useful. So decoloniality for Walsh and Mignolo, and here from Walsh, I quote, "Decoloniality denotes ways of thinking, knowing, being, and doing that began with but also precedes the colonial enterprise and invasion. It implies the recognition and undoing of hierarchical structures of race, gender, heteropatriarchy, and class that continue to control life, knowledge, spirituality, and thought, structures that are clearly intertwined with constitutive of global capitalism and Western modernity. Moreover, it's indicative of the ongoing nature of struggles, constructions, and creations that continue to work within coloniality's margins and fissures to affirm that which coloniality has attempted to negate. Decoloniality in this sense is not static condition, an individual attribute, or linear point of view of arrival and enlightenment. Instead, decoloniality seeks to make visible, open up, advance radically distinct perspectives and positionalities that displace Western rationality as the only framework and possibility of existence, analysis, and thought. Such perspectives and positionalities evoke and convoke what Maldonado Torres refers to as decolonial attitude. From the first glance, this kind of definition sounds like everything and nothing. But when reflecting more about the same attitude, it's not that complex, but also not that new. Of course, as we know that different schools of thought, particularly those of critical thought, for example, have also critically discussed dominant Western paradigms, doing injustice to other kinds of knowledge and epistemologies. In the above book that I cited, throughout the writings of Medina Tlostanova herself, decolonial thinkers bring examples of decolonial thinking and action, which include movements driven by the global dynamics of capital accumulation, such as ideological aggression through representation. It's more in Tlostanova's work, drug mafias, mega projects, such as energy, tourism, extractivism, and environmental degradation. So these struggles, often not explicitly framed as decolonial, aim for radically different social orders and can be understood as decolonial due to their focus on creating an alternative futures. This perspective does not impose the concept of decoloniality into those movements, but broadens how we can view decoloniality as a form of action, insurgence, and prospective praxis. When one discusses different concepts and complex theoretical ideas, one immediately asks a question of so what? And what is added value of using these concepts and not others? We already know, or these ideas are not new, etc. I'm with you with all these questions, but I still think that I would like to bring, for example, I'm still convinced that this explains or opens up more space of thinking about very known concepts from very different perspectives. Just I bring you a very, very simple example of such concepts like capitalism, modernity, which is not a new concept to us and which can mean very different things to very different people, depending on where you are and what kind of people asking from what kind of perspectives. So I will just give the example of capitalism, for example. So here I will quote again Walsh. I quote, "For Zapatismo, capitalism is war," quote unquote. "In its present phase, capitalism is a war against all of humanity, against all of the planet," says Zapkaliano. I note here Zapkaliano is a pseudonym figure associated with Zapatista movement in Mexico, specifically with the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, previously known as Subcommandant Marcos. Zapkaliano became the public face of this movement in the 90s, speaking out against neoliberalism, capitalism, and state oppression. So this is a very charismatic leader and spokesperson. He played also a very significant role in uprisings of the same movement in 1994, which was focusing on the plight of indigenous people in Chiapas in Mexico. So I continue quoting Walsh. "This war, of course, is not just economic. The war also comes in batons and shields of police, in evictions, in the media campaigns that precede and later justify invasions, in the patriarchal violence that invades most intimate corners, in the heterosexual intolerance that stigmatizes difference, in religious fanatism, in modern markets of life, human flesh and organs, in the chemical invasion of the countryside, in the contents of the press and media, in organized and disorganized crime, in forced disappearances, in government impositions, in the masked dispossession of what is known as progress, in some, in the destruction of nature and humanity." End of quote. So the concept of capitalism as war, as articulated by Zapkaliano, cited by Walsh, provides an example of a different analytical frame for understanding the same concepts typically discussed in modernity and capitalism, unlike the common Western view of capitalism as economic system, centered on growth, profit, progress. Zapkaliano frames it as an ongoing war of exploitation and domination. So this perspective, to my mind, broadens the scope of capitalism's impact, recognizing its violence, not just in economic terms, but also in structural violence, from police evictions, militarization, to environmental destruction and cultural erasure. In Zapkaliano's analysis, capitalism's war is not limited to economic transactions, but includes symbolic violence, such as the patriarchal and heteronormative systems that reinforce societal hierarchies. These structures perpetuate oppression not only in the form of exploitation of labor, but also through the subjugation of marginalized groups, including women, racial and other minorities. Furthermore, capitalism perpetuates a global war that affects both humanity and the planet through ecological degradation driven by resource extraction for profit. This destruction of nature, alongside the displacement of indigenous populations, depending on where the extraction is done, is framed by capitalist ideologies as progress, a term that masks dispossession of land and resources from those who are affected by these actions. So this kind of critique invites a decolonial rethinking of modernity and capitalism, urging us to recognize that capitalist systems are not neutral or progressive, but instead structures of ongoing conflicts. These interpretations highlight how capitalism operates on multiple fronts, economically, socially, ideologically, and ecologically, and maintain global inequalities and systemic violence. Decolonial praxis in this context provides decoloniality with a concrete sense of prospect, project, and purpose. This means that decoloniality is not simply a theoretical framework, but a practical approach to analytical thinking, acting, doing, and theorizing, all grounded in praxis. In other words, I again quote Walsh, referring to Sylvia Wynter's concept of action, reflection, action. It involves not only the present and the past, but also, I quote, the correlationality that grounds ancestral non-Western knowledges, worldviews, and life practices, and that orients a perspective prospect, proposition of struggle for a different model of life, living, knowing, and being in this world. This is the essence of political, epistemic, and existence-based insurgency referred to here, and its decolonial prospect, praxis, project. End of quote. Also, I agree with many aspects of arguments discussed by our Latin American colleagues, namely critique of modernity, which is also not new, as we have already a long time ago thought about also multiple modernities. And I would like to remind here about Russian version of the same modernity, such as современность. Soviet modernity or современность, or Russian ways of forcing their vision of modernity in Central Asia, is remembered differently by different persons, both who themselves experienced or heard about it from their families. The Soviet experiences of modernity, or Soviet modernity of early 20s, has its own dark sides when one carefully considers all the facets behind these ideological projects of Soviet, for instance, performed in Central Asia. In Central Asia, the Soviet projects of modernization was largely positively remembered by many women, depending on the period of the Soviet rule, such as not earlier experiences of building modernity, but rather those who were enjoying the fruits of those modern projects, such as accessing education, employment opportunities for women in Central Asia. And I would not accept this kind of one-sided analysis of modernity, and instead I would suggest considering various experiences of modernity which are advanced by those in power, each with their own ideological, political, and economic interests behind those modern projects. A distinction, I think, should be made between the planners of modernity, who can largely be unified as a self-interest-oriented elites, driven by an ideology that often seeks to destroy the original existence of local peoples and cultures, and the experiences of the populations and places where these modern projects have been implemented or to be implemented. These experiences of modernity differ and are told by different terms, negative, positive, neutral, depending on the factors such as age, country of origin, location, time, gender, and other identity markers. So how can we make sense of these contradicting views and conflicts which result from nationalizing or nationalist discourses about colonial past, which are similarly argued in line with decolonial debates and postcolonial critique. What positionalities matter for what kind of decolonizing projects, and how can we bring coloniality of power to light in order to do this decolonial work? There is fortunately a growing scholarship of authors who write from Central Asia or with Central Asia, and here I again would refer to the writings of Madina Tolstanova, who shows many important insights into the ways how could we participate in the production of alternative knowledge and futures of knowledge production. Alongside with the ideas drawn from Tolstanova, Annibale Quijano's ideas about coloniality of power helps to uncover the complexities and dilemmas I partly was sharing with you. Quijano's concept of colonial pattern of power, where power matrix is defined as a system formed through modern capitalist imperial colonial powers on a global scale. In Quijano's phrasing, I quote, coloniality of power is based upon racial social stratification of the world population under Eurocentered world power. But coloniality of power is not exhausted in the problem of racist social relations. It pervaded and modulated the basic instances of the Eurocentered capitalist colonial modern world power to become the cornerstone of this coloniality of power. End of quote. I would like to build the later critical discussions of the same decoloniality scholarship led by Albrecht from 2020 by advocating for multidirectional, intersectional analysis of key aspects of power and domination, particularly in relation to Quijano's concept of coloniality of power. This framework allows us to explore how coloniality continues to shape social, economic, and cultural dynamics in Central Asia, offering valuable insights into regions' ongoing struggles with modernity, sovereignty, and global power relations. Above, I was talking about positive experiences retold by women who praise Soviet modernity projects which unveiled them, educated them, took them out of their houses and gave them jobs, which is also, of course, contested if we also include those voices from rural areas and others who less benefited from the same project or at least resisted such changes. Alongside those positive experiences of women who enjoyed fruits for which many women earlier sacrificed, of course, their lives, as early period of unveiling happened with lots of bloodshed, as many were stoned and killed. There are also darker sides of the same Soviet and later Russian modernity, современность, or the westernization of the post-Soviet period, or Arabization of the 2000s. So all of these ideologies, whether Soviet, Western, Arab, represent forms of imposed influence on Central Asian territories and peoples, to my mind. As an Uzbek national who grew up in the Soviet times and studying in post-Soviet times, conducting anthropological study in the region, during the both post-Soviet, late post-Soviet or Arabization periods, of course, my analysis of those experiences will be biased, as I am considered obviously to be современный or Soviet modern woman with feminist ideas, living as a minority member in European country, trained in all Western, non-Western, local, Russian, scientific ideological frameworks, which influences my analysis, of course. Alongside my own parents who still maintain Soviet nostalgia, I would find more benefits in Soviet modernization projects embodied in myself and my parents, and judge against Arabic influence or Russian domination presently. These examples imply that binary of dark, black, or bright or white, where the Western is viewed as inherently bad or colonial power dominates everything, while non-Western is seen as inherently good. I think this is very much oversimplification. In reality, it's much more complex. In order to make sense of such a complexity, understand these complex processes, again, I will ask for help from Aníbal Quijanos and his ideas on coloniality of power, using it in a more broader sense. Let us just pick out the whaling issue here. Also, Soviet modernity projects were not only about whaling. We know that Soviet states needed more workers, including women, to get them out of the houses. They needed to unveil them, modernize, whatever modernization called, educate them, etc. But discussions about the whaling, de-whaling or re-whaling in Uzbekistan or Central Asia in general is a very complex issue. And if we talk about only whaling in Central Asia, these are very different experiences depending on the politics done on whaling on different countries in Central Asia differently. So this discussion of forced unwhaling, which occurred in early 20th century, was violent, as I said, and resulted women dying in the process. If we view this from using the decolonial lens, this can be seen as part of critique of Soviet modernity projects. Today, re-whaling under Arab influence presents similar challenges, particularly regarding whether the Arab way of practicing Islam and dominating local Islamic practices and whaling traditions. Also, the hijab is largely promoted as trendy, modern, in some regions, depending on state, of course, policies against hijabization or radicalization in Central Asia, which have been evolving over the last 10 years. So the question remains open. So, is it decolonial to re-whale women in Central Asia? In order to break free from Soviet modernity and return to what some women described as Stone Age, Kamenny vek, as many women have compared this post-Soviet period of re-whaling to the situation of Afghan women today. The Arabization of Islam observed in Central Asia today, when analyzed through Quijanos' model of coloniality of power and the colonial matrix of power, reveals Arab influence in areas such as Islamic education, infrastructure, architecture development, etc. And this also suggests that a form of Arab-centered knowledge production and domination extending beyond Islam. So how do we define decoloniality in this context? Do we decolonize by unveiling women in Central Asia? What kind of critique of modernity can we point to here? I don't have answers. Again, I ask help from our Latin American colleagues. So using these theoretical models proposed by Quijanos helps to distinguish those who hold power to enact coloniality from those who don't, thus positioning the latter in solidarity with decolonial efforts. So this complex situation or context leads me to another problem of defining white. Namely, white male, which impersonates coloniality. Arabs, who would be defined in colonial terms in the context described above, would not fit the typical colonial white European image we usually have in our minds when we discuss coloniality and decolonizing work. Here, Daswani, 2021, intersectional definition of whiteness is important to move away of simplistic understanding of whiteness as Euro-American white male, whereas his definition opens up the same category for a wider interpretation of whiteness through intersectional analysis of powerful location, educational background, and positioning within elite academic hierarchies if we talk about academia and knowledge production. The widening of the same category or call for better understanding of white supremacy, which is not enacted only by those who are white or male, but allowing also possibility of non-white individuals, like Black, Asian, or others, who continue the abuse of their position and power, reproducing the line between powerful and those not in power. Also, its helpful attempt to diversify the understanding of whiteness and white supremacy, I would rather call it power abuse system, built through the logic of white supremacy and colonial past, there is a danger of overseeing differences of positioning of non-white, whatever it is, anthropologists who might be gaining the same positioning as other white anthropologists from the point of view of the other, whatever it is. If a non-white anthropologist who had a degree within elite universities or universities in the West and trained to use Anglo-American discourses and theories can become also white, this necessarily doesn't mean that he or she became fully white, but rather had to negotiate the positioning within the hierarchies of whiteness within the academic world, whereas hierarchies in the context of communicating with the other might be the space where both non-white and white anthropologists are shelved into one and the same shelf. A more nuanced discussion of the same ideas about whiteness, I think you can read from Rano, who really go to the psychology of the same issues. Since we started to switch to academic work and research, slowly turning to important domain where decolonial work needs to be done, it's not only important to define whiteness and domination, but also touch upon methods as important property of defining research in terms of ethnographic research in the global south and knowledge produced largely in the global north, predominantly in English language. Linda Twice-Smith has early on, 1999, set the standard for decolonizing research with her famous dictum that research, I quote, research is a dirty word, end of quote, for most indigenous people around the world. Feminist, decolonial thinkers, authors of writing culture debate, authors of postkolonial debate, and many others made their point very loudly clear that things, at least within such critical disciplines like anthropology, cannot continue existing in the same modus as it was 50 years ago. We have another century, we still only do the talking with minor changes, such as within the field of African studies and Latin American anthropology, which is, we can see some at least changes. The same goes for the institutional setting of knowledge production, where white male-dominating discourse dictates the rules of academic knowledge production, distribution of power, and career paths. The printing business sets requirements for a certain style of writing, shared norms of recognition of authority over certain topics, which is also decided in top-down manner. And also, who is not following, the researcher or an author who is not following those requirements is not granted an entrance card within this printing business. People of color or those who cannot eloquently master the language of colonial power do not easily make it to the first-class printing houses, which opens doors within career paths. This is, of course, rapidly changing with the introduction of the artificial intelligence. So another open question here I have in mind is, am I white and doing colonial research, producing knowledge in English and contributing to the Western knowledge production, applying Western tools when producing this knowledge? Absolutely, is the answer, but no answer to the question, how can we change it? Again, to my own positionality. I have conducted anthropological fieldworks at home and also in Russia, working together with a human rights activist with whom I also published texts together and participated in the conferences together. Unfortunately, this colleague is sitting behind the bars in Tajikistan since 2021 due to his activist work in Russia. So the knowledge produced on Central Asia has been dominated by Russian colonial past. As I already mentioned earlier, that Central Asia has double or even multiple colonial heritage. First, the region was made into 5 republics by Soviet government out of nomadic and sedentary populations, ethnically intermixed throughout the long history. Also, full of other colonizations happened before Russians came to the region. And post-Soviet period was marked with a Western domination alongside with remaining Russian domination of political, economic, and academic fields. The Soviet ethnographers studied the region to be able to govern it, and then the Western scholars came to dictate their vision of development. So what we observe in the field of knowledge production here, that we observe the clash of knowledge traditions here between Soviet ethnographia and Western anthropology, which opened up another kind of debate which is still continues. It started in, I remember the debate in the Max Planck Institute decades earlier. And considering my own status, I'm habilitated and have no permanent or tenure track position or no permanent contract within Western academia. I think my knowledge brings a very limited change, or having no voice within powerful decision-making system relevant to the knowledge production in my field. Of course, it's complicated to make an argument, am I part of this system or not? And how much I'm part of it? So the question for me is now, how can I change this? And how can I take part more within those decision-making systems? So I will bring some of the snapshots of what are the problems related to the knowledge production in Central Asia and related issues with collecting data in Central Asia. When telling you about how I managed my research collaborations that I already briefly mentioned, and try to address dilemmas related to coloniality of our research, I also touch upon some of the issues and dilemmas we faced all when doing our research, organizing also academic events, which are also related to coloniality of power. I met this colleague that I mentioned, a research partner who was based in Moscow as an activist and lawyer, in a conference organized by German, Swedish, Turkish institutions, where also migrants themselves and also those who worked within NGO sector were invited in 2015. The event was organized with the aim to bring researchers, politicians, practitioners, and migrants themselves to come together and discuss their daily problems of migrants in Russia and migrants in Turkey. The format of the event allowed a forum where researchers spoke about migrants' lives, migrants also spoke about their own lives, and this led to different discussions than those we usually are used to when we organize our academic events. And as a result of the discussion, of course, so what questions were asked. So the justification of these so what questions is that we are less seriously interested in the lives of peoples we study, but rather focus on our personal careers and advancement of the disciplines that we are studying about. As a native anthropologist, I argue that what is important for me is to contribute to the improvement of lives back home. Moreover, even if we concentrate on the theory production, it's imperative to critically question imported epistemologies, be it Russian or Western, and reflect on modes of knowing that are connected to the region where we live. Studying societal problems for the purposes of contributing to the series explaining human behavior is obviously not so relevant for those who we study. How can we continue research in the way that we serve not only our discipline and our careers, but also return something of lasting value to people themselves? In academia, some collaborations have been made between Western institutions and Central Asia and individual scholars from the West. But how much lasting effect do these engagements produce? And even if these endeavors helped to produce a new generation of Central Asian scholars or scholarship, the epistemological power hierarchies remained in place and have even increased. This repeated implicitly a development that had started decades earlier when Bolsheviks had taken control over Central Asia and turned Khanates into Soviet republics. So local traditions of knowledge were undermined and banned. Russian socialist perspective replaced them. Institutions of higher learning were founded and promoted imported knowledge in Russian. After 90s, the local scholarship was forced to follow discourses produced in Paris, Harvard, Yale, as my colleague who is based in Uzbekistan said. They are now required to publish in Scopus journals in order to get their promotions or salary improvements. He said, we are drowning in scopusomania. So the big and open question remains still, how can we decolonize knowledge production under the conditions that I described just now? After the Soviet Union ended, now these states are independent since 1991, other powers entered different fields such as economically now dominated largely by China, now where even some lands have been given up to decrease the over-indebtedness to the same countries, such as in Tajikistan or in Kyrgyzstan, and intellectually domination of North Atlantic scholarship engagement. American universities opened, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, and other NGOs are also operating and producing knowledge. So anthropological research of the region is still in the beginning stage, where some basic issues and topics remain uncovered. Also, there is by now a good bulk of works produced by dominantly Western scholarship. Native anthropologists increasingly appear in the academic landscape in the West, still within limited space, with limited funds. And there are very few native anthropologists from Central Asia who have permanent positions or in the decision-making positions within Western academic landscape. The position of scholars is important in considering the choice of funding, topics, research questions, directions, and policy formulations. Unfortunately, major funding comes from the West to the region, and those who make these decisions, like if it's about funding, hiring, or advising, are mainly scholars from of Western or European origin. Academic positions and financing the research are crucial and decisive in the process of decision-making about the topics of research, sharing the knowledge, knowledge production, discourse production, and representation. Participation of Central Asian scholars in the academic discussions is also limited to external funding, despite a scholar will be a full faculty member at a university or research institute where a faculty member or any scholar employed within Western academic organization will have a better access to financial resources. In an encounter, I would like to mention very briefly that I had in one of the conferences that was organized by US funding, complained that she couldn't attend the discussions in the conference, which was organized in Central Asia itself. I don't remember, it was in Kyrgyzstan, because she couldn't afford the registration fee. And to my question, why wouldn't you be able to participate in discussions, but you don't have to participate in the lunch or coffee breaks? She answered that she was not allowed to enter those discussions, which I found really ridiculous and made me think even more about this kind of barriers and and constraints that local researchers face. In this context that I telling you about the anecdotes that I encountered myself was really ridiculous to my eyes. Of course, this also then connected to the other kind of powerful situations where coloniality of power can be shown, like if we talk about citation business or if we talk about citation politics. I already mentioned some printing businesses. Of course, this makes us think a lot about positionalities and opportunities for native scholars and other scholars who have this kind of limited funding and positions within such contested spaces. I'm not sure how much time I have already used. A lot, I'm sorry. So, but I would like to leave those questions. Of course, there are a lot of things that concern me a lot, but as I said, I cannot cover all of them. But what I think, what I raised so far, the questions that unfortunately remain open, I think tell a lot about what we can do to decolonize our thinking about certain things, to decolonize how we do our research, to decolonize how in our teaching, how we teach about certain topics, etc. And I think the authors of Decoloniality Debates offer us a lot of opportunities to do that using this decolonial lens. And I think I leave you with all those questions, and I'll just drop there these comments that I received for my piece earlier, of course. Now it's published in a longer version from Anthropology Today. So I just leave it there, open, and thanks for being with me. And sorry that I couldn't offer you answers for all these questions and very complex questions. But I will be very happy to start the conversation and answer your questions. Thank you very much.
So you have to give me also this. We have to share it now with the auditory for questions.
Okay.
We have only one.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And now the floor is open for questions, either in English or in German. Both is allowed.
Yeah.
Please.
Why is decolonial? I guess I don't need it. I'm loud enough, I guess.
Yeah, but we have one student too.
Okay. So why is this decolonial discourse always referring to the most, to recent empires, but never to the previous empires, even if they have shaped the social fabric of Central Asia much more profoundly? So I mean, the presence of Islam in Central Asia is itself the result of three waves of imperial expansion of the Rashidun, of the Umayyad and Abbasid empires. What about the Tang Empire in Central Asia or the Safavid or Ash'arid empires, which have very profoundly shaped the region, but which are completely left out of the discussion? And that all the discussion is so much fixated on these two empires, and that there's, so to say, no global perspective on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you for raising this important question, because I think this is also one of the main critique of decoloniality debate, who are actually not even, I mean, Medina Tolsanova, of course, covers the Soviet imperialisms and Soviet colonial experience, etc. But Mainly, if you look at the Latin American literature, these are more about Western colonial experience, more focusing on the Latin America, etc. If you look at other colleagues, they're of course looking at also slavery and etc. These kind of histories. But the region, that's why I'm saying that the Central Asia as within this decoloniality debate, to my mind, is still in embryonic phase, I would say, because these debates are very, very young. I mean, I remember in 2018, it's how many years ago? 7 years ago. Nobody even thought about what kind of colonial past we should talk about now. Maybe we should just leave it to historians. They should study the history. We anthropologists, we are just busy with today's processes, and we didn't talk about what kind of past shaping, what kind of present. So these are very, very new discussions. So I'm glad that at least this discussion started. And as I said, one of these main critique of decoloniality debates is that they limit their discussion with very particular kind of colonial past and particular kind of colonial experience. And that's where I join saying that the region has not only double, maybe multiple colonial heritage which shaped the region and all these discussions. And I think these discussions develop also, now I see more and more movements. For example, I was part of the Esimde movement, who's also very much historian, nationalistic discourses about their past and how they want to make sense of their past, but still these movements are very new, but they're appearing, and I'm very glad that these movements are gaining their momentum as we speak now.
Other questions? Yeah, please.
More response. Yeah. Okay. I'd like a double response. So I'm an archaeologist, so I deal with past empires, probably more than present ones or recent ones. I think if you ask that question, then it kind of goes back to like, okay, how far do we go back to what is like authentically Uzbek, Mongol, Kazakh, like all of this? And I think obviously we should look at different empires, and obviously there's like different layers, but I do think that starting to look at the Soviet Empire and the Russian Empire for now is very important, also because they're the most recent ones and the ones that will be a point of reference for people in the present. So I think if you start talking about the Shinnu Empire in Mongolia and how that would have impacted today's Xinjiang, I'm not sure it will be maybe that immediately relevant to people.
Would you please?
Can I add to that?
Okay.
Thank you very much that you continued this discussion, because I wanted just to comment on that. I think what you're saying is very, very, I think, important to what we consider for what kind of context. I think it's very important, for example, to decolonize how the history is represented in the region. Yeah. So of course the people should know their history not in the form they have been presenting before, like Russian version of it or other versions of the history or nationalist version of the history that is present in the textbooks today. So in this context, it's very important that young people read about their history in their schools and education in the very objective form, whatever objective form is. But in the discussion about what is really authentic what is very Kyrgyz, authentic Kyrgyz is, what is authentic Uzbek is of course a different discussion. But I think going back to the histories, I mean, I mean, I'm not a historian, but I think we all know that the discourse about the end of history and what kind of history tells us what kind of history, what kind of sources tell us about what kind of histories, etc. I mean, these are many other questions that I don't want to open, but I think it's important also to decolonize curriculum in schools, I think.
May I give a question back, because we have here a very interesting, fascinating discussion. And so I understood your definitions at the beginning about coloniality and colonialization, that the authors promoting coloniality are not talking about going back to something authentic, yeah, but it's a kind of utopia, social new order, criticizing actual capitalism, its structures, power dominance, even also in knowledge production, etc. But that's something completely different compared to what now popped up. Looking what is authentic Kyrgyz or Uzbek. I mean, this can't be. It's impossible. It's always nowadays in recent construction, imagination of past. So you can't go back to a status quo in the past or imagine. So this is also a risk. And you mentioned several times nationalism. You know? It can be taken by the construction. If you do nation building, yeah, you have to create some kind of joint image, yeah, and you can fill it with something authentic, which is, of course, never ever authentic. So I have some fears if we mix up the question of authenticity with the idea of criticizing power relationships in the recent world, then we end up in nowhere. So that was my comment or my impression.
I think we end up in new wars. Yeah, of course. I mean, what I was mentioning, how the decoloniality debates find their homes in nationalist movement or nationalist rhetoric is not where decoloniality debate wanted or planned to end. I think this is kind of misleading or confusion about all this debate is, of course, I mean, everybody can misuse anything and abuse anything and turn it into their own cards. And we cannot prevent that. But I think we have to be aware of this kind of misleading rhetorics and debate, which kind of debate and where. So if we are very reflective about these things and if we are clear about the definitions and if we are clear about how we use these terms and where we use these terms, I think nobody wants that any new wars start. For example, if Mongolia will start now going back again, then start war with Russia, I think.
Okay, there was another question.
Dear Rano, thank you very much for your wonderful, lovely and thought-provoking presentation. As a historian, I cannot help just a little bit add to your very seriously formulated question before I just refer to your presentation in more detail. Especially as perhaps many students who are present there also have disciplinary training in history. There is no guarantee in any kind of merits of using the flexible terminology of current social sciences when applied to historical in ancient times or medieval times where archaeologists also have their saying. This would be a revisionist exercise of such a scale and which doesn't necessarily bring or involve these highly specialized historians working on various periods. And if we look at the history of developing debates on the decolonial in the 21st century, but also in the 20th century, we see that also in Central Asia, in Soviet Central Asia, where decolonial was very much discussed in the 1920s and 1930s, as a part of the global Red Project, that these debates on the colonial, those times, I mean, various interpretations of communism, they did not necessarily correspond to the real progress of research. Now, this is also something what worries me at this point when I look at this decolonial boom, also in public domain in Central Asian countries. What I particularly liked in your presentation, that you pointed out these not shared epistemologies that are very much persistent and that also in a way divide the academia, as we know this academia here in the so-called West, in the imagined West, because we don't know what it is in fact, and the national historiographers, their current status quo in Central Asia. And what strikes me very much is the tendency to perceive the current decolonial in Central Asian states as something very much exclusive, as something up to the point of isolationism, in the way that there is very little understanding of the legacy of the process of decolonization in the 20th century, and just the writings also, for example, of Arab authors, as long as you mentioned Arab authors, as early as in the late 1950s, based on their experiences also in academia, in the US academia, as decolonial, with all the multiple decolonial experiences that they had. Also the experiences with the Soviet colonialism as they understood at the end of the 1950s, when they were trying to resist and to portray the Soviet impact in the Middle East as a way of spreading Russian or Soviet colonialism. If you see the same processes of persistent stubbornness or stubborn persistency, not to be compared and not to dwell upon those decoloniality debates that existed, let's say in the 1950s and the 1960s, but even earlier, if you see these tendencies in a way as I see them, would you have an explanation why this persistent stubbornness exists, of not just being open to build parallels and to compare this decoloniality?
So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Irina, for this opening up. This is also another important aspect that you also mentioned about, that this is another kind of critique of decoloniality debates, that they focus on a very particular kind of history or on particular kind of debates and experiences. So I think, as you say already, you mentioned, I think, jihadism, I guess, right? So, and other kind of movements within Islamic studies and all these debates, which critically, of course, discuss the Soviet colonization in those times, etc. I mean, these are, I think, all the debates that should be included in our discussions. As I said, this is a very young movement and young debates, and I cannot really answer your question why it's not compared and why it's not included. And I think it's a work for future, but I can understand that there is a lot of work to be done within this field, and also historically, as you mentioned that. I also mentioned that these debates are not new. We had very different kind of movements, if we're not talking about only Latin America or African colleagues in the region. I mean, your works also, you do a lot of historical work in the region. So I think this should be done also in an interdisciplinary manner. Coming together with historians, with political scientists and others who work on the same issues. I think as I said, there is a lot of work to be done there. But why this comparison is not done, I cannot answer that question, but thank you.
May I switch the topic? I'm a sociologist, and so you mentioned this gender topic here, and this was, I think, the way you presented it was really important, asking this question. So we have Soviet modernity, which that in fact brought progress. May I say this? Progress. That's exactly my question. Made brought progress for women's rights and education, work possibilities, and so on. And then we had this the 1990s, and in the feminist literature, this was often discussed as process of retraditionalization of gender arrangement. And you mentioned also now the new influence from Arab countries, a special Islam tradition. And you said we cannot solve it so easily. And my point is, or my question back to you is, maybe this whole conceptualization of decolonialization or decoloniality offers us too little instruments to understand this. You mentioned Eisenstadt's multiple modernity. So does the Arab new Arab influence bring anti-modernity, anti-modern, or is it a kind of mixture, new mixture? So why not talking about progress or regress? Is it really necessary to abandon all these terms as Western? And why not work also with multiple modernity to understand this complex? But that means not to reject modernity per se as something Western.
Thank you for a very important question, I think, that I tried to address in my talk a lot. I share, and I shared also in my talk, these concerns. Why talk about decoloniality when we can talk about multiple modernities? Why not? Because multiple modernities include other kind of modernities which are not defined in the West. But the problem will be, I think, with this if we call it multiple modernity or whatever we call it, I think that it limits us again to the ideas about modernity. If we like modernity as a concept or not. So the problem is that it's not only about modernity or progress, whatever you want to name it, but it's a problem. It's much more beyond that, and that's what goes back to the ideas of Rano to think about coloniality of power in terms of, Foucault very much talked about different kinds of definitions of power and etc. But I think if we think more beyond these kinds of binaries of what modernity is, what is regress, or what development in kind of binary terms, this kind of imprisons us to certain kind of models that are still goes back, even if it's multiple, then still modernities. So I think what decoloniality debates or calls for us is to open up all these models that we have in the West or outside of the West, and to consider other kinds of models together with those models that I'm not joining, and I don't think that the decoloniality debate is calling for getting rid of any kind of concepts, but appreciating not only the Western culture or philosophical ideas, very rich ideas, but also consider other kinds of epistemologies that is relevant for the one or another region, if we study those contexts, of course.
Okay. Chance for questions, for the questions.
thank you for your wonderful presentation. So I just was wondering about the term you used in Russian, "современность." So I was wondering about it, I mean, growing up in the end of the Soviet Union, coming out from Central Asia, I have never heard современность. Do the Soviets use this word? I remember hearing культурность, right? So how do you kind of distinguish these two terms? And as you mentioned that you have been doing research in different parts of Central Asia, and so you kind of generalized Central Asian countries, but 2 years ago, having a chance of traveling also Central Asian countries and analyzing kind of like a distinguishing kind of a nomadic Kyrgyz Kazakh, and also you coming out from, I believe, in Uzbekistan, is like kind of a Russian past or Russian colonial past is perceived differently. Like we can talk about Russification, right? So do you distinguish this Central Asian countries' perception of Russian past and coloniality in between these countries? So I would be very curious to hear more.
Thank you for raising this question. Of course, I mean, you find all kinds of also other concepts like цивилизованный or civilized. I can add to that group, which kind of denote some kind of modernity that can be implied. Of course, the definition of современность, современная женщина, or modern woman, whatever it means, in whatever context is that. I mean, of course, I'm referring to Uzbekistan, where they use a lot of also культурный or цивилизованный or Russificirованный, Russified, modern, cultural, civilized, modern, современный. These are in the same categories that I'm trying to refer to, saying that there are obviously existing different conceptions of the same modernity, which we should talk more, I think. I think there is that Dabaev made very interesting observations of oral history of what it means actually today, this Soviet past or Soviet nostalgia, for nostalgia, what is it, for example? So I think this kind of works, like Timur Dabaev did in Uzbekistan, I think needs to be done to really reveal this kind of differences. I'm sure there are all kinds of differences, even if they're similar concepts that are used in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan very differently. But I think I believe at least that they refer to the same definitions that I was referring to. Thank you.
Okay. Final chance. Okay.
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to say before, but thank you so much for presenting this in a very comprehensive way. Do you feel like perhaps anthropology or ethnography, depending on where you are, ethnography, blah blah, is moving in a direction where maybe it's accepted that something can be modern and traditional at the same time, or in parallel, or maybe that one doesn't exclude the other, versus like maybe this more traditional anthropology focus on what is traditional. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you for your question. It's a very classical, I think, question for anthropology, because there is a lot of critical debates about what tradition is, what is modernity for this country or another. So, I mean, these are, of course, very much critically discussed. I mean, if there is a modernity, as our colleague now I myself also was talking about other kinds of modernities, right? I mean, maybe you have also contexts where there is no such understanding of modernity or whatever we mean by modernity. So these are very classical anthropological debates that are, of course, very much old, and now we critically use, when we use this kind of very difficult terms like tradition, culture, modern, is very difficult terms to use, but we try to avoid to use this kind of concept. And if we use, then we try to define it, referring to the context where we use it, or our interlocutors use it or define it. So it's very much critical, as I said. But I wouldn't say that in anthropology we arrived there where we would like to be. I mean, considering all these critical debates, I mean, we even talked about end of anthropology, not only end of history, but also end of anthropology, because obviously, as you also saw from the reviewer of Anthropology Today, who said actually you cannot really decolonize such a discipline which is based on colonial past. So this is, I think this is here where he says that I think it's not possible to decolonize such a colonial discipline like anthropology, which I don't believe actually, because I'm very much actively engaged in this decolonial debate, and I believe that one can still decolonize even such colonial disciplines as anthropology.
Okay, that sounds like a short question.
Okay, I try. What do you think about that it should be part of decolonization to not dismiss positive memories on the Soviet Union as nostalgia, but really because you used it at one part, I forgot the context, but I think it's very harmful to dismiss such memories as nostalgia because it very much blocks a view on local epistemologies from the time, from the region, and I think there are very productive works from, for example, scholars like Ingeborg Weilaub or Artemi Kalinowski who really much show how much you can pull out of these memories if they are taken seriously and not wished away as nostalgia. So, more like a comment.
Sounds like a comment, yeah, in fact, but
I would
final word.
yeah, I thank you for picking this up, because I don't think that erasing anything in any kind of history is a good thing to do. Also, I mean, what I already mentioned, that in some kind of movements that are using decolonial debates, which have more nationalist agendas, I think there are some efforts also to kind of rewrite other histories. And there is another debate about, can we still use post-Soviet when we talk about certain regions because we are not post-Soviet anymore, etc. This kind of debates, right? So what can we erase and what not? And I don't join to any kind of efforts to erase anything. I think everything, if it's colonial past or other kind of past, I think it belongs to the experience of the same context we are talking about. So thank you very much for raising this.
Okay, so thank you.
Thank you very much for also discussing with me. It really was nice to discuss. Thank you very much.